All right, everyone, this is our second recording on Chapter 6, and this one will focus on polling. So as we've talked about this chapter, the first section of Chapter 6 focuses on how we get our political opinions, political socialization. And so this area will focus on how we measure political opinions. So we'll look at polling. While as we emphasize polling, there certainly have been times in which the polls have been wrong, or at least you can interpret them to be wrong. It's a little more complicated than how I just described it. But in 2016, the election of Donald Trump for the presidency, there were many outcomes that didn't suggest that that was going to happen. So it did indicate that the polls were wrong. And as we can see here, 538, one of the sources that I've suggested that you can use for your research, for your news reviews, and I would think you should just look it over just for your own information. They had some articles that came out shortly after the election, noting that, as we can see here, it was an upset. Trump had a 15% chance of winning, according to their analysis, and their analysis in previous elections had been very accurate. So one of the areas here that indicated why the polls appeared to be wrong would be that whites without college degrees in states, they outperformed than what the polls suggested, that either people didn't answer in the most accurate way when they were being surveyed, or perhaps more likely, they just weren't being contacted. So this suggests what's oftentimes referred to as a selection bias in the polling, that just key populations were not being accurately monitored and used in an accurate way in the survey, in the outcome of the survey. But in most cases, the polls have been accurate, and really in 2016, according to 538, and this is one of their articles, you can Google this and get this article, and I would urge you to do it. It's a very interesting article that's related to this chapter. The polls are all right. And so polls in 2016 were about as accurate as the polls since 1972. Really, it's about that time in which we see the techniques that we use in polling really start to take off. So in fact, they were more accurate than other cases. In 1992, Bill Clinton being underestimated, and in 1980, Ronald Reagan was also underestimated. As the article points out, in both those cases, the individuals that were underestimated in the polling went on to win the elections. So it didn't matter that much that the polling was not entirely accurate. So that's, I think, a key part, as we can see there in the next bullet point. So the candidate that won was not picked to win in 2016, and that's what leads to many of the questions about the 2016 polling. It is also, though, very worth noting that it's the Electoral College, of course, that elects the president. So the polling did not accurately reflect the Electoral College. However, when we look at the popular vote, the polling was actually pretty accurate, because Hillary Clinton did get more of the popular vote than Donald Trump. But since it is the Electoral College, this then means a state-by-state analysis of the polling becomes extremely important. And so the state polls showed a closing near the end of the campaign, especially in these three upper Midwest states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And that's 46 electoral votes. So when you're in a pretty close election, we can see how that would be significant. You need 270 electoral votes to win. So when you look at that, you can see in 2012, in the re-election of President Obama, those three states, if you break it down, red, blue, blue being the Democratic candidate, red, the Republican candidate, that in the blue states, of those three blue states went with, or those three states were blue in 2012, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. You can see those in the upper Midwest, especially Michigan and Wisconsin being in the Midwest, not necessarily Pennsylvania, but in the northern part of the country, I guess we can say. So in 2016, those three, along also with Florida and Ohio, went with Trump. And that really explains the election. So it was close, and in many ways, the surveys would have indicated that it was too close to call. But nevertheless, it's a key reason why many of the polls were not entirely accurate in 2016. So in all of this, it just lets us know that it's inexact, and there are some times in which the polls are not necessarily going to be accurate. One of the things that we can clearly see on Then, Now, and Next on page 220 is that it doesn't make sense nowadays to use a telephone poll, even though that's what's been used, but those polls are really not very accurate, just like mail-in or door-to-door polling. We can see how those would be some issues, but at least with door-to-door, you would know exactly the person you're talking to, right? But it has some issues there with being random and just very time consuming to do something like that. But of course, telephone polls, I mean, if you don't have people using landlines, then that type of polling can be very inaccurate as well. So we do internet polling, but of course, some of the problems there is who's exactly doing the polling, and could it be hacked? And those also can be some issues that are raised from that. So in the future, perhaps other kind of social networking sites. I mean, could you do a poll on TikTok? Could you do a poll on Instagram? And maybe those are the ways to do it, but always I think you're going to clearly have some questions, as we mentioned before, about selection bias. Who is in fact being used in the poll? So when we do polling, we can see here, is it a way of making sure that you have accurate depictions of the people in the polls? And that becomes, in some ways, difficult to do. So we can see here with the issues of religiosity, the states that are more religious tend to be more conservative. So there has to be this issue to make sure that they're going to be accurately used in the polls for both sides. So the number of people you have in the polls, the questions that are going to be used, and the sources, the system that you use for the polling, whether it's telephones or online, those are very important. But also what's important is to have an accurate portrayal of the population. So there you can see how that becomes key when you use those different maps. Okay, so here we can see also some differences when it comes to our populations. So once again, when it comes to polling, what about the age of the people that you're interviewing? You can see right here, if you had 1,000 people in a poll, but they were all baby boomers, then that would be a very inaccurate poll. It's not reflecting the overall population. What we do see here is some indications too, then, that you could really skew perhaps the results if you have a disproportionate number of people of one generation in terms of their ideology. And see, we can see here also perhaps some differences when it comes to policy. And the one that's used here, of course, is with legal marijuana. What is interesting is that for many of these generations, you see that a good number of them have a fairly similar outlook on that policy. And so that can change with different age groups as well. So you have to consider the generations that are being used in the surveys. When taking a sample, so to make sure that a survey is accurate, you have to have a good sample. And we can see this in so many different areas. I mean, after all, if some of you perhaps are studying biology, well, if you were doing some sort of survey on walnut trees, you know, you couldn't look at every walnut tree, right? You're going to have to take a sample of walnut trees. And so be the case here with voters. If you're trying to figure out how the voters are going to react in a certain election, then you can't survey every voter. So you have to have a sample. Sample has to be random. That's, as we can see here, with the different uses of social media, very challenging. Sample has to have an accurate size and must reflect the diversity of the population. All of that very challenging. And we can see from each one of those bullet points explanations as to why surveys may not be accurate. So to try to combat that, we can see here the uses of quota sampling and stratified sampling. So quota sample is representative of the characteristics of the target population. And so you try to make sure then that you have as accurate a group of people in the survey as what would be with the general population. This can mean that you have surveys that ask some rather personal questions. How old are you? How much money do you make? Where do you live? What's your religious outlook? And people may not want to answer those kind of questions, but it is important, or it can be, to try to ensure that you have an accurate sample. So perhaps one of the ways of dealing with that when it comes to geography is just, as we can see here, divide up the national population and just divide it up in fourths. And that may be a way to combat the overrepresentation and underrepresentation of some areas of the country. So here, a sampling error, I mean, one of the reasons why that may happen, and any type of sample that you see should state that it has a margin of error. And that would then just indicate that the survey itself is not stating, the people putting the survey together are not stating that it's 100% accurate. There's going to be some wiggle room. So the differences in results between the sample result and the entire population. So ideally, you could see 1,500 people polled. As we can imagine, that's probably not going to happen in most cases. And so it's around 300 to 500. And you just stop and think about that. If you had 300 people in a survey, if it was a national survey of a country of over 300 million, you can start to think real quick, there's real possibilities that that's just not going to be able to, it's not going to accurately portray the population. So you may have something like a margin of error of 5%. And if you take in a chemistry class, if you had a 5% possibility of an error, I mean, that's just thrown right out the window. But if you're looking at something here involving human beings, then 5% might be something you can live with. But even there, notice there, if you have a survey in which it's very close, one candidate's at 51%, the other candidate's at 49%, and the outcome of the survey asking people which of the candidates you're going to vote for, you're most likely going to vote for, something like that. Well, if the margin of error is 5%, notice there, anytime that you can see that the margin of error is greater than the difference between the two candidates, then it is within the margin of error, and it's too close to call, and you can't really state that one person is ahead. So it's a 2% gap between the candidates. You had a 5% margin of error. You can't then say that really one candidate is leading. All you can say is that it's too close to call. Different types of polls, and this is on pages 219 to 220. You have tracking polls, which you measure trends. This can oftentimes be used in business. Look at an advertising campaign and perhaps see how people have reacted to that advertising campaign. Of course, that can certainly be used in politics as well. So if you're asking people how things are going on their viewpoint about a campaign and which candidate they're going to support, and you ask them, a group of voters, that question, for 2 straight weeks, every day, not different people, but you still do the survey, again, you can more than likely determine that you're not going to have a large number of people in that survey, which leads to a greater margin of error. Push polls, we're going to go into more detail about that, but that's a campaign technique and it's used to skew public opinion. So it's not really there to gather accurate information. And then exit polls, question voters after voting. One of the big issues about an exit poll is who participates in the exit poll. Will everyone participate? Might there be some people that are more likely to participate than others? And so if one group of voters for one candidate are more likely to participate in the exit poll than the other group of voters, then you can see here that that's going to lead to a distortion on what the exit poll may state as compared to the actual outcome of the election. But those are all some important types of polls and how they're used. Let's look at the push poll. And one of the best examples of ever using a push poll came in 2008. So 14 years ago. It was a key turnaround in the Republican primaries, the Republican nomination system, helping George W. Bush, who went on to win and defeated John McCain, who at this time and early on in the campaign was actually leading. But in South Carolina became the key state to turn around the outcome of that election. And one of the ways of doing that was using the push poll. There's no evidence that you would have had Bush himself making this poll, or perhaps even given the green light for this poll. However, we can see that it was pretty powerful. And again, skewing the results, as your textbook says. This is from an older textbook that really went into detail about this. So John McCain has an adopted daughter from Bangladesh, which is in South Asia, country in South Asia. She has very dark skin. So people would have seen her on the campaign with her father. And as we can see here, the use of the push poll. Callers working for Bush supporters asked conservative white voters if they would be more or less likely to vote for McCain if they knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child. The statement's not accurate. And so really the information from the, yes, no, don't know, it doesn't really matter how people would respond to that, because that's not the reason for doing the push poll. It's to give people this seed in their mind about John McCain. Did it work? Well, George W. Bush won. So that can be one of the ways of looking at the outcome of the push poll. It may not have been the reason of the outcome from the push poll, but we can see that it's perhaps then at least a very strong coincidence in that case. So here we are with looking at this issue about a push poll. So write this in your notes and kind of think about it. If you were running for the US Senate in your state, would you green light a push poll? Would you do this and say, yeah, whatever it takes to win, that's what I'm up for? And would you do something like that? All right. So that's the end there for chapter 6. Look for later on this week some recordings on chapter 7.